Good afternoon, y'all. If I can have you take your seats, respective seats, come on over. Yes. The final closing plenary. We've made it almost. Come on over. Let's have us take a seat. Good afternoon. It has been such a meaningful and joyous experience having so many of us back in person, to be precise, more than 1,000 of us back in person this week in Detroit. We were all witnessing the incredible talents of our young artists and hearing so many inspiring and challenging conversations from many of our leaders. A couple of hours from now, to be precise, at 7:30 p.m. Eastern Time, I look forward to seeing you all again at Orchestra Hall, where our 3 senior division laureates of the competition will compete for the $50,000 final prize, performing with the Sphinx Symphony under the direction of Kalina Bovell, whom some of you may have heard this morning. I hope to also see as many of you as possible tomorrow at 2 p.m. at the legendary Hill Auditorium in Ann Arbor, where the touring Sphinx Symphony Orchestra will perform a full program with our professional exigence ensemble under the direction of Tito Munoz and Eugene Rogers. Now, for our friends who are leaving but might be from DMV area or from New York, you can come see us again with that same program at Kennedy Center on January 31st at 8 p.m. for their Washington, D.C. debut. Don't miss it. This will be the final celebration of the anniversary, 25th anniversary. And now, it gives me a great pleasure to introduce to you our closing plenary host. This individual founded the Sphinx organization more than 26 years ago as an undergraduate violin performance major at the University of Michigan, where today he serves as a professor of arts leadership and entrepreneurship. A violinist by trade, he is also an Emmy Award-winning filmmaker, best-selling author of 5 books, and serves as Poetjournalist in residence for the Wright Museum of African American History here in Detroit, as well as the Fisher Foundation, Ovation TV Network, the Rodham Institute at George Washington University, and Char Music, where his poetry reaches more than 200,000 people each month. Friends, ladies and gentlemen, familia, it gives me a great pleasure to welcome to this stage my partner in life, a MacArthur Fellow, and the founder of the Sphinx organization, Aaron Dworkin.
Hello, everyone. Thank you very, very much. Thank you, Afa. And this has been so exciting. Obviously, right, all of the sessions have been extraordinary. But most of all, what I've heard people remark about is the energy. Like that there's this energy, the feeling that they've had over these days. And so I think it's just been absolutely wonderful. So it is my honor to introduce our closing plenary guest who will be joining me for this conversation. Michael R. Jackson holds a BFA and MFA in playwriting and musical theater writing from NYU Tisch School of the Arts. As a songwriter, he has seen his work performed everywhere from Joe's Pub to the National Alliance for Musical Theater Conference. He wrote the lyrics and co-wrote the book for the musical adaptation of the 2007 horror film Teeth with composer and co-book writer Anna K. Jacobs. He wrote the book, music, and lyrics for the musical White Girl in Danger, which is in previews, I believe, very soon will be in previews for its world premiere in just over a month, and has received a 2017 Jonathan Larson Grant, Lincoln Center Emerging Artist Award, ASCAP Foundation Harold Adamson Award, a Dramatist Guild Fellowship, and was a Williamstown Theater Festival Playwright in Residence. He has had commissions from Grove Entertainment and Barbara Whitman Productions, LCT3, and others. However, what most of you probably know him from is his extraordinary creation of the musical A Strange Loop, for which he has garnered more awards than we can even share here this afternoon, but include the Pulitzer Prize for Drama and 11 nominations resulting in 2 Tony Awards for Best Book and Best Musical. Everyone, please join me in welcoming Detroit native, playwright, composer, lyricist, and self-proclaimed trash talker, Michael R. Jackson. I am so excited to be able to spend a little time in conversation with you today. I'll also be going through some pictures, and I'll also go to a few video clips as well during our conversation. But I thought we'd just start off. I mentioned you're a Detroit native. You came up here. Can you just share with us kind of your experience here, and especially how you got into music?
Yeah, so I am, from Detroit, in the city limits, born and raised on the west side. I was sort of involved in music and taking piano lessons from the age of 8. I was singing at church, I was playing at church, I was taking dance classes, I was taking acting stuff. I was very sort of just in the arts from an early age here.
That's awesome. And so was there any key role that any organizations or ensembles played in your life during that time, and as you kind of were developing? And there's so many people in the audience and tuning in online from around the world, are either at organizations, have founded ensembles, and just wondering, was there any role of institutions and or groups in Detroit here in your life and in your development?
Yeah, well, I definitely would say, I went to Cass Tech. That's CT. And so I wasn't super involved in the music program there, though I did randomly for a semester. I took harp with Detroit's own Patricia Terry Ross was my teacher, who I loved her. She was fantastic. So I randomly can kind of play the harp a tiny bit. And but the big group that I was involved with was this group called the Brazil Denard Youth Chorale. Which I was in the youth chorale from, I want to say, 7th or 8th grade all the way through my senior year of high school. And being in that group was sort of really important for me because it exposed me to a lot of classical music that I just wouldn't have learned about otherwise, and singing and sort of appreciating it. And then I also, from that, I took piano lessons for a brief time with Arthur LeBrew, who was recommended to my family by Mr. Denard, and so I was just deeply immersed in sort of classical, sort of choral music and singing, in addition to sort of taking piano lessons on my own, which I had done for growing up. I had sort of learned to play by ear. I was playing, piano at church and so forth, and just really immersing myself in different styles of music that whole time.
Awesome. And the power of kind of institutions, there's so many, and Brazil Denard is one of those for here in Detroit. And anyone who doesn't know, Sphinx partnered with the chorale ensemble, helped us to premiere the Symphony of the Sphinx years ago, and just has played in such an extraordinary role in so many people's lives. So it's wonderful to hear. Is inspirations. So I heard that Tori Amos is a huge inspiration. Can you share kind of that inspiration and any other key inspirations that really sparked your creativity?
Yeah, so funny story with Tori Amos is that I was 15 years old, and my cousin had briefly gone to Interlaken, and he came back to the city, and he brought he was like, there's this artist who I think you would really like. I don't know why she thought I would. Probably because she played piano. That was what it was. And she gave me Tori's first 2 albums, Under the Pink or Little Earthquakes and Under the Pink. And I just, at that age, I was really starting to find myself, I guess, I was searching for myself at that age. And I was feeling, sort of my angst level was at a teenage angst level was at its height. And one night I decided to just pop in Tori's second album, Under the Pink, and I just heard the music start playing, and it was unlike anything I'd ever heard. And she's sort of really interesting in this hybrid of sort of like classical music and rock in a way that I just had never heard that before. And and her lyrics were sort of really mysterious, and it was just the right combination of things for me to dive deep into. And I sort of immediately began trying to imitate her as like a teenager, and because I was constantly just improvising anyway, because I played piano for the choir at church, but I would listen to her music and I would sort of try to imitate it stylistically. And that ended up being something that became sort of a part of my sort of compositional development, because I never studied composition formally. It was sort of all by instinct, and because I had perfect pitch, and I was singing and I was learning to read music, and so it was a real combination of all of that. And I sort of credit Tori with sort of giving me the inspiration to explore and to sort of really sort of seek out what my musical voice was, even though I wouldn't formally study songwriting until grad school.
Wow. And so kind of following into that, not every student coming up in Detroit gets to go to NYU Tisch. Mm-hmm. How did that come about?
So that also is a funny story, because that came about because my number one school was Columbia. I was like, I must go to Columbia and be with my white friends on the quad. That's what my mindset was at the time. It was a different time, but that's what my mindset was at the time. Because I had two friends who were a year ahead of me who were there. And I put all my eggs in that basket. I mean, I applied to other schools and everything, and I actually had a scholarship to Michigan State. But then what happened was at Cass, I had taken creative writing as my elective for all 4 years, because I was really into writing. That was my passion, was poetry and fiction and everything. And we had a program that the head of our English department brought in called Inside Out. And Inside Out, which is a Detroit organization that sort of brings writers in residence into schools. One of those writers in residence, because I worked with different writers in residence for all 4 years of high school, one of them had read a short story of mine and said, "Oh, this seems very cinematic. Have you ever thought about screenwriting?" And I was like, "No," because at that point I thought movies just kind of sprang out of the ground. And so, but at that period, it was sort of times when you start looking for schools. And so I was like, okay, Columbia's number one. And I was like, oh, and I see NYU has a dramatic writing program. That sounds good. And I just applied there as a second, as an afterthought. And so then that spring break of my junior year, I think it was, I was visiting New York, and I was staying with my friends at Columbia in one of their dorms, and I called my parents, and they read me my Columbia rejection letter. And I was like, oh, so sad, no being with my white friends on the quad, wah, wah, wah. And then, but then they read me my NYU acceptance letter, which I had forgotten I'd even applied there. So I was like, okay, well, I'm in New York, so why don't I book a tour and just go down and see what it's like. And so I went down there, and it was not really a campus, but it's in the city. And I was like, oh, that's really what I want, is to be in the city. And so I somehow convinced my parents to take out all these Parent Plus loans, and I took out student loans, and I went to NYU to study dramatic writing, because the other part of the story was my real big dream at that point was I wanted to write for soap operas. I was a big soap opera fanatic, and I figured I would go to NYU and then become the head writer of One Life to Live. that was gonna be my journey. But I got sort of pulled into theater. But that's how I got in NYU, was through
awesome.
The dramatic writing part of it. Yeah.
See, this is where you see the essence behind our artists. This is
yeah.
amazing. So, so you're at Tisch. Mm-hmm. Can you share with us, there are so many who are part of the Sphinx community who are creators, who are composers. Can you share with us about your creative process? You're there at Tisch, and then you graduate. Can you tell us about the creative process for A Strange Loop?
So I went to NYU for undergrad, where I sort of immersed myself in just learning the craft of playwriting, screenwriting, TV writing, etc. And that was sort of how I spent, the next 3.5 years, because I graduated a semester early. And then when I graduated, it was a semester earlier than I thought, and I suddenly was like out in the world. And I was not prepared for that. I moved to the middle of nowhere, Jamaica, Queens, to this old lady's house in the second floor of her bungalow style house. I was I had no job prospects. The world was in a sort of very tumultuous place leading up to the start of the Iraq War. And I was 23 years old, 22, 23 years old. And I was just very uncertain. And so then I started writing this monologue called Why I Can't Get Work, which was just sort of a stream of consciousness monologue about sort of the young black gay man walking around New York wondering why life was so terrible. And so that was just that for a while. And in the meanwhile, I was applying for jobs and applying to grad schools, and I was going to say, whichever sticks, I will do it. And it just so happened that I had applied for a job at CBS Daytime to be an executive assistant to this high network executive, and I applied to these grad schools, and I got rejected from all the grad schools except for NYU Musical Theater Writing, and then I didn't get the soap job. And so I always tell people that if I had gotten the soap job, I wouldn't be writing musicals today. And I also would be out of the job because all of the New York soaps went defunct 10 years later. So I was like, okay, well, I got into the NYU program, so I'm gonna go to give myself 2 more years to just sort of figure my life out. But what ended up happening was I went into the program, I applied to the program specifically to be a book writer because I had the playwriting background from undergrad, and I was gonna learn how to write lyrics. And so that's what I was doing. I did not apply as a composer. I wasn't thinking about being a composer. That was not on my menu at all. But then when I got into the program, I learned how to write lyrics, and then over the course of the year, I really got a handle on song form. And then at the end of that first year, we had this class where a teacher, this guy named Mike Reed, who is one of the songwriters who wrote the song "I Can't Make You Love Me" that Bonnie Raitt sings, he was a collaborator to the chair of our department, and he gave us an assignment that said, if you're a composer who's never written lyrics or a lyricist who's never written music, go ahead and try it for this one assignment. And since I'd gotten a handle on lyric writing, the musical impulses that I'd had for all the years that I was growing up, just sort of improvising on the piano, sort of had a place to go. And so I went away, and the song that I wrote was Memory Song, which, if you're familiar with A Strange Loop, is the sort of penultimate song in the show. And at that time, the song was just meant to be a standalone song just for me. I had no sort of dramatic intent around it at that time. But it went over really well in my class, and I was encouraged to continue writing my own music, even though I was going to be paired with a composer for my second-year thesis project. And so I just kept writing music on my own, just for my own edification, and people just kept encouraging me. And what ended up happening was a lot of the songs sort of had a personal take on them, similar to Memory Song, and then those songs started to work their way into the monologue, which I had written a couple years before. And then that just began this slow process of finding this story and writing more music that was specifically tailored to the piece, as opposed to being these standalone song moments. So it was a real organic process that just took a lot of stop and start and just slow exploration.
And I love in terms of what you've shared, this combination of both the life experiences, even getting rejections from different places, and how just letting that help you find your path, but not letting it ever stop you, but just letting you evolve based on what the world was throwing at you.
Yeah, and I think also, because it's very easy to take it for granted, that at that time, that period of time, I had no plan B, and there wasn't anything out there to tell me to have a plan B. This is sort of pre-social media. And so that back then we all thought for ourselves. and so, and so I kind of think that like if social media had been around there, I would have not been thinking for myself, and it never would have occurred to me to just explore and to try it and to like not worry about whether it was going to be successful or anything. It was just all about, I had this story to tell and I'm just going to do it and see what happens.
Right. Oh my gosh, it's amazing. So I have a couple of clips. As I mentioned, this is a clip you were on Sherry Shepherd's show. And so we have a quick clip, and I'll ask you a question after we take a look at it.
Talking about a strange loop with a lot of people on staff, they were like, this is my life. You were telling their life. But you say that this is not autobiographical.
Yeah, I always use the term self-referential because while I did draw from personal experience to write it, it's not a one-to-one ratio of events in my life. It's very much a mix of fact and fiction. And, and I also often say that, for some people, the show is like a mirror and for other people is a window. And so that way, like, you may not come from the walk of life that Usher does, but you still can see into like a human experience. And then that is the thing I think that sort of brings the audience together and makes a really rich exchange of energy between what's happening on stage and what's happening in the audience.
Yeah.
So, right, beautiful, beautiful answer. A lot of people ask you about, is it autobiographical, obviously, if you're Usher. The question I wanted to ask you is a little deeper, just about identity. And wondering if you could just share with us how you view your own identity, personal identity, and or professional identity, and is there any differential between the two? And part of the reason that I ask is that I think there are many, and I certainly have and continue to go through this process of those parts of the Sphinx constituency who are thinking about and or developing their identity, especially their personal identity, and wondering how much of that can I bring to my professional identity? Can I bring it all? Or, how do I blend those two? And just wondering, what has been that journey for you?
So the journey for me has been, because A Strange Loop began as this sort of personal testimony / even in the beginning stage when it was sort of maybe more what one might consider autobiographical, even then there was still an air of fictitiousness to it, because I was trying to elevate the experience to something that was greater than than just me at that time. And yet, what was also true is that, like, especially as the piece evolved, and the piece is like, it literally starts off, saying, the Usher starts out labeling himself with this long hyphenation of identities, of like, I'm a gay and or queer and or homosexual, black, blah, 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 descendant of slaves. Like, he says all these little identity markers, right? And yet, part of what I was searching for in telling this story was to even question what any of those things even mean. That, like, when you hear black or queer or gay or homosexual or whatever it is, that, blah, blah, what does that really mean? It's like there's what people think when they hear those words, but inside of each of those things is like a multitude of a million other things. It's a loop each of those things is a loop within a loop within a loop within a loop. So when I think about my personal identity, like on one level I can say, like, I'm a gay black man, whatever, like there's that. But what that means to me is very different what it means to someone else who would also identify as that way. There certainly might be things that we would say bind us together, but like when you get down into the soup of it, it's so many things, which is what the concept even of A Strange Loop is, because it's about this definition of what the word I means. When you say I, you're asserting like millions of things at once within this neat little letter that are a combination of all of your experiences, all of your fears, anxieties, desires, etc. And so for me, this question of identity is not a simple one, because you can't show everybody everything when you say I or this is my identity. So how that intersects with my professional identity is that, well, I'm a musical theater writer who wrote a musical about I, the concepts, which also happens to have been drawn loosely from me, Michael R. Jackson, multi-hyphenated individual. And so I think every person does bring whatever their identity is to their professional life. There's just different degrees of how they do that and how they express it and what it looks like, what it sounds like, what it smells like, and what it feels like as well.
Right. It's amazing. And also just hearing how you bring both the professionalism but that authenticity to your work. Humor. Wanted to talk a little about humor and comedy. It's obviously very important to you.
It is.
Michael's website, by the way, is thelivingmichaeljackson.com.
Which I've gotten in some trouble about that
right.
from the MJ fans. The MJ fans do not like that.
So, and while I couldn't recount everything on your website, it does also include even a fake bio, which includes certain mentions of like the series The Real Housewives Go to War-Torn Sudan, and children's programming, Sex and the City for Kids, and a host of other things I won't be able to mention here at Sphinx, but this humor, it's so powerful. And just wondering, what do you think about humor, and do you intentionally try to use it as a mechanism for some type of result or impact?
It's really funny you ask about that, because I've been thinking a lot about humor these days, because I feel that the world has lost its sense of humor, to be like very honest with you. And I think that humor, the ability for one to poke fun at oneself, especially, is so important, because the I, the ego, all of it, it's like it can get so inflated and so self-serious that you actually lose the ability to connect with other people and to be empathetic. And I feel like humor, people who really are in touch with their humor can't get that narcissistic, because the purpose of humor is to literally reach other people, to make other people laugh, to see something that's true or that's, about the human condition, I think, as they see it. And of course we're not all gonna agree on like what's funny, but I think just the impulse to try to make somebody laugh is like it's part of why we're alive, I think. And so I feel, especially as somebody who works in the arts, if I can harness that to like tell a story, to draw, to illustrate a character, a moment, something like experiences that like you might have in your life that are hard to describe, if you can make them funny, it means that you're able to make it relatable to other people who may not have had that experience. So I find humor to be like a powerful elixir that really can bring people together.
Awesome. So you've won just a couple Tonys, and this is a quick clip just after one of your Tony Awards, and wanted to ask you a question on the other side of it.
Michael R. Jackson!
Hello.
How's it going? Congratulations!
Thank you.
A Strange Loop is now a big black queer ass American Tony Award winning Broadway musical. We are here in the First Impressions tent, and America wants to know, how are you feeling right now?
I feel that if you're nominated for a Tony, you should write down your speech. So I feel good. I feel
Beautiful.
good. I feel like I feel so happy, but I'm like also like, oh my God. So.
Well, I have to tell you, this musical is truly, it's a remarkable piece of art. You've been having a really hard year.
Yes, sure.
Yes, you've gotten all of the recognition. And you know what, you are writing to an area of the LGBT community that is often very underrepresented in mainstream musicals. What does it mean to have this kind of recognition for this part of the community?
I think it means that that there's a crack opening. I think that it means that people are starting to sort of sit up and think about the people around them, that like we're becoming maybe a little bit less myopic. And that, for me, feels like a win.
So you mentioned about this feeling like a win. Are you optimistic about where our nation is headed, or are you pessimistic?
I don't believe in binaries. I think I can be both at the same time. Like I'm optimistic about some things, and I'm pessimistic about other things. But you know, as Joni Mitchell once said, life is for learning. So it's sort of hard for me to give a simple answer to that, because it sort of depends on what you're talking about.
Totally. Kind of like maybe a follow-up to that, is there anything that stands out that you're optimistic, like, wow, you know what, we may be getting to this better place? Like, is there something that stands out that gives you really a sense of fulfillment or optimism of?
I think that if there's something I'm optimistic about, it's that I feel like despite how fractious everything might be and how much change is in the air, or how much fractiousness is in the air, that I think that like people, there's like a sort of subconscious like circadian clock in people for bullshit. Like that's sort of like, okay, we've had enough of this, and we're gonna actually turn the page on it. And I feel, without getting too specific about it, I think that like there's certain things that are happening in the world today that people are like rolling their eyes at, even though on the surface it seems like they're not. Like, I think people are starting to like get hip to the bullshit. I mean, I know that I'm being so purposely vague, but so I'm optimistic about that. What I'm pessimistic about is this humor thing. Like, I really do think that there's like a problem in the world, and in America in particular, about sort of the ability to poke fun and to poke a hole in things and to satirize and I feel like the arts are suffering as a result because of that sort of like tight. It sort of reminds me of like in the 90s when like Tipper Gore was like, don't rap, don't say bad words in rap music. But I feel that coming more from like the progressive side of the column in some ways, particularly in the arts. And that I feel is having like really detrimental effects, which is part of the reason why I'm turning up the volume in my own work, because I can't stand it. I don't like being that suffocated, and I don't like all of this sort of like, you can't say this, and you can't do that, and this is offensive, and that's, and no, and the nun's coming around with a ruler to rap your knuckles for every little thing you want to say and do. I don't like it. I categorically reject it. And I'm all in. And of course, we want to be respectful. You want to honor people's, experiences. You want to punch up and not down, and all of that. I get that, but it feels like to me there's something more sort of like disturbing about even the impulse to say what you have on your mind and to try to like be funny about it. But I also think that kind of thing also runs a course, and then people get tired of it. Mm-hmm. So it sort of ties into what I'm optimistic about. So I feel like my optimism and pessimism are always sort of like chasing each other.
Yeah. We wanted to talk just a little about the business side. So we talked about your creative process for A Strange Loop. Guaranteed, there are those in our Sphinx constituency who have created some extraordinary work, composers, other creators, and now they're sitting there and they're going, now, how do I get this out there? How can I get it noticed? How can I have some of it translate into some compensation so I can keep creating? Can you share with us a little bit about the business side of how you've been able to achieve some of this extraordinary success?
So the funny thing about that was, I think part of the reason, and this is, some people are not gonna like this answer, part of the way that I've achieved any sort of financial or business success from my art was by focusing on my art. That like, I never set out to become successful. In fact, once I really got into the swing of writing A Strange Loop, I had ushered on Broadway for 5 years, so I was like, I saw Broadway up close. So it was not like I thought, I like was standing there at the Lion King and Mary Poppins being like, oh right, next step Broadway for A Strange Loop. And so I just stayed focused on but I wasn't gonna stop doing what I wanted to do because I cared too much about it. And so I was like, it was just something I cared about to keep pushing at it. And my highest aspiration at the time was that maybe I would get like a nice off-Broadway production. And that for me would have been enough. And so everything that came after it was like the thing of dreams. But I never made that the center of my intention. The center of my intention was, what does Usher want? And how do I dramatize and musicalize that? And I stayed on that like obsessively for almost, 15 years until I got that production. Only because I cared enough. And so it goes back to that old expression when people say, they're like, if you would do this and not get paid for it and would still do it, then that's what you should be doing. And that's sort of how I felt, because I wasn't getting paid for it. And I still wanted to do it because the alternative was what I was actually doing in my life at my day jobs, was like working these horrible day jobs. And I was like, I don't have anything else other than this, so I might as well just keep doing that. And so, but then, there's the practical side of how did, the success come. Part of it was I switched agents. Like I had an agent who wasn't really doing very much for me, and as the piece was developing, other people started to get wind of it, and this one agent reached out to me and was like, I'd really like to represent you, and he was at a big agency. And I decided at that point to sort of bet on myself and take a leap to a huge agency where I could have just disappeared into the ether, but going to that agent ended up being really crucial to the beginning part of my success, because he was able to leverage the power of that agency to like get me in front of a lot of people to see the art that I had spent, the last 15 years working on. And that then began to open other doors. And sort of that's, and it's not gonna be the same for everyone, but like the thing that I think is important is like, what is the thing that you actually are trying to get people to see and put out there into the world to get you to that success? You have to like love it, like to sort of like to an obsessive degree, or else, because that's all that's gonna sustain you, no matter, like when everything, even in the success, like I've been like fairly successful over the last couple of years, and yet there's been a lot of struggle even within the success. And if I didn't have the thing that I loved to hold on to as my life raft, then I would have been totally miserable. Even, so I just think like, make sure that whatever it is that you're working on is like the thing that you really love, and that you know why, and that you can defend it like a child. That like, that's your baby, and you love it that much.
Wow. So I want to just remind everyone to be thinking about any potential questions, and those tuning in digitally from around the world know that you can use Hopin to submit questions. But you were, of course, on The Daily Show with Trevor Noah. I wanted to play a short clip from this and ask you a question about that, and then we'll go to audience questions.
I watched people in the audience feel something. I watched everyone walked out just making sounds. That's when you know. No one said anything. Everyone was just like, oh, ha, ah. It was beautiful. But then I wondered what you got by creating this, like for yourself. Did it change anything in your world?
I mean, I guess for me, the best part of the show has been actually talking to people after, when it lets out. Because what I've been finding is that for some people, the show is a mirror, and for other people, the show is a window. And that seeing people there together experiencing the same thing but through those two different lenses creates a really powerful energy that sort of goes up onto the stage, goes to the actors on stage, and they send it back, and it really brings the audience into the loop of the show, of the character's mind that we're in as we're watching.
You had a great, I forget what was the phrase you called it. You said it was like it was a big gay...
Big black and queer ass American Broadway show.
I love that.
Right. So I love this reference that you utilize about a mirror versus a window, and I was wondering if you could just kind of share with us about how you view this medium of the arts and its role in American society.
I mean, I think the arts are, sort of going back to something I was saying earlier, are the way that we connect with each other. Like the artist's main job, I think, is to show the world, an audience, what they see. Like there's something that they see or experience or feel or whatever that's sort of intangible that they want to be able to share with a group of people. And they have to use the form in order to create, to sort of take it out of their minds, out of their vision, and into the minds of other people. And I think that that's a really important, process and mechanism, in the world, because we live in our bodies and we can't always see what other people see. We can't always empathize unless we know what's inside of them. And I think the arts is a great way of transmitting sort of those messages and experiences. It's like the closest we have to like telepathy.
Yeah, absolutely. The people can feel free to go up to the mics. And one last quick question before we go to them. Pulitzer, couple Tonys. What are you looking forward to next? And can you tell everyone just a little bit about White Girl in Danger?
Yeah, so I mean, the thing I'm looking forward to next is White Girl in Danger, which is my next show we go into rehearsal on Tuesday. And White Girl in Danger is, as I mentioned, I have a sort of lifelong love of soap operas and Lifetime movies. I grew up watching them. My mom, when I was a little kid, both my parents worked, and my mom would drop me off at my great aunt Ruth's house, and we would watch. The day would go. 10:30 was Sale of the Century. 11:30, I think, was Classic Concentration. 12:30 was Young and the Restless. 1 o'clock was Days of Our Lives. 2 o'clock was Another World. 3 o'clock was Santa Barbara. And and I was like, 5, 6, was before I started kindergarten, and I just got really into the stories. And White Girl in Danger is sort of drawn from the stories, but also this other sort of thing in the world that began to happen was people starting to really talk about diversity, equity, inclusion, representation, et cetera. And I just started to, as a black writer, started to meditate on what that meant to me, because even I found that these conversations about inclusion tended to net benefit white writers more than black writers. And I just was wondering about that. And so this molecule of like my sort of soap opera obsession and this question around inclusion and representation sort of came together to form White Girl in Danger, which is set in a soap opera town called All White. And in the town of All White, there's 2 races and classes of people. There's the All Whites who have like fantastically crazy stories for days, and then the Black Round. And the Black Rounds have 2 story modes, which are slavery and police violence. And and those stories just happen over and over and over and over again until one of them, this plucky girl named Keisha, sort of bemoans her sort of tortured existence. And that's when the all-white writer, who's sort of like an Oz-like figure in the world, announces that one of the all-white girls has been killed by the all-white killer, and the role of best friend will now be filled by Keisha. And so then Keisha becomes a best friend to Megan, Megan, and Megan, who each have this sort of like trope all-white girl problems. One's got an eating disorder, one's got an abusive boyfriend, and one's got a globe-trotting mother who ignores her. But then she figures out that being a best friend is not enough. So she starts scheming and plotting to steal their storylines away, and then and she starts to become the center of the all-white story, and that's when the all-white writer sends the all-white killer after her. Because the all-white killer is picking off the girls with these stories, but then the all-white's identity is a big shocker, and it flips the story on its head. And it's a musical. So, so I'm excited. I'm taking a big, ambitious, big, risky, ambitious swing with it, because there's a lot of hidden depths to it underneath the sort of fun. But it's the thing I'm most excited about.
Woo. Get your tickets now.
Yeah.
We'll start on this side and go back and forth, please.
Hello, my name is Jamie Sharp. I'm an arts leader and I'm also a singer here with the Exigence Vocal Ensemble. I had the pleasure of seeing A Strange Loop last year on Broadway, which was incredible, of course, you already know that, but one thing I noticed is that there weren't a lot of people in the audience that looked like me, and that's kind of a common theme that we see, especially in the classical music space. And so my question for you is, as we continue to expand representation on stage and receive accolades and compensation from white audiences, how do we ensure accessibility for our own communities to experience our art as well?
So I think that this is a question I get asked like quite a lot. And my response to it is always one of curiosity and sort of pushing, I'm sort of interested in like questioning the question in a sense, because I feel like, in my experience of going to see A Strange Loop, which I've seen like a bunch of times, it's never been a majority Black audience for sure, but there's always been Black people in the audience. And so I always say, I'm interested in the Black people who were there as opposed to the ones who weren't. And I say that because I feel like the accessibility is also bound up in that is also the question of like who even wants to be there, and who, like, I can't assume that everybody who looks like me even wants to be there. There are people who look like me who have seen the show and don't like it. And so I feel like it's a little complicated in that, but in a more direct answer to your question, I guess I would say there's lots of initiatives that exist that are about getting folks, of color into seeing shows on Broadway, but I also think that like there's, the show will be licensed, and then then theaters can do it themselves, and I think that like I want to empower people to find the audiences that will see it like in their own communities. Like New York City is not like a small community. It's a combination. It's a melting pot of like so many different people who come to Broadway for a very specific experience. And so I just think it's like a very complex issue that doesn't have just like one answer to it.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you so much. Yes.
This question is from Hoppin. Humor can be a delicate thing where people laugh at someone versus laughing with someone. How do you balance the framing of that artistically and culturally, bringing audiences along with you?
So I think that, the thing with humor is that it's very subjective, and like one person's laughing with is another person's laughing at, and I don't think that it's my job to control that. I can only sort of focus on I can only really focus on my intent. I can focus on my intent much more than on my impact, but I do try to be very thoughtful about what it is that I'm doing, because if I'm making a joke, it's usually, for me, coming from a place of character and of like trying to sort of like tell the story very clearly. I'm not the kind of humor that I'm interested in is not like easy targets and trying to get people. It's like I'm trying to sort of communicate some sort of emotional truth that is funny or not funny, but like I make it funny because it's so painful, you know? And so I think it's about just being specific about what it is that you're doing and what's the, like, are you, when you pull back the arrow and let it loose, like, are you hitting the target, or is it like flying off to the left or the right? And so I think that comes with a lot of practice and a lot of sort of deep thinking about what it is that you're trying to do.
It's such an important issue these days with humor, and people have very active viewpoints and perspectives.
Yeah, but I think that some people don't think that you should, like, I actually do think that there's a lot of people, without saying it explicitly, are anti-comedy. Like, they think that the very fact of it is an oppressive force in our lives. And that, for me, is one of the things I'm pessimistic about, because I don't believe that. And it's hard to say, because if you believe that, then you believe that. And if you don't believe that, then you don't believe that. And there's actually no common ground on that. So I sort of have to just hold my ground on that and see and time will tell, like, how people feel about it.
Yeah, awesome. Thank you. Yes, please.
Hi, I'm Jennifer. I'm an arts administrator from Houston, but I was really lucky to see the tryout of A Strange Loop in DC, so it's an amazing work. A lot of the conversations that we've been having during the conference is about our legacy institutions within classical music and how often these diversity initiatives sometimes feel temporary. How do we get them to be sustainable? And it made me think about the narrative on Broadway this season, where like A Strange Loop and Ohio State Murders, Ain't No Mo, all these shows are closing early. But I think of a show like Chicken and Biscuits, which also closed early, and I heard it's like one of the top produced shows around the country this season. So it's making me wonder if you as an artist and creator is so concerned about the sustainability of one show within a structure like Broadway, in the same way we think about orchestras, or for you, if it's about, again, just making sure the piece is successful and that, you know, it finds the right place.
So I think this is sort of connected to the person's question earlier about audiences in a way, because I guess, like, sort of in your question, because I've been asked this too, is like, how do I define success? Like, is sustainability and success about whether a show runs commercially? And like, if a show runs, like, commercially, like, for a long time, does that mean that it's an artistic success? If a show closes earlier than expected, does that mean that it's not an artistic success, or does it just mean it's not a financial success? And that's the thing that I find a little slippery, because I'm sort of like, yes, a lot of these shows did close on Broadway early, but the reality is that most shows close early on Broadway. Like, most shows do not even break even, they don't recoup their investment or their capitalization. And so I'm not saying that you're doing this, but what I find, sometimes the narrative sort of feels like, oh, all these Black shows closed early, and so therefore that means that they're not artistically successful, or that, like, their job is to be twice as financially viable as anything else, when, like, a white show like Almost Famous can fail and no one bats an eye at all. Do you see what I'm saying? And there's something a little insidious inside of the analysis. Not you, but I'm just saying, because I've been hearing this for a while now. And so for me, the real measure of success will be whether those of us who've had shows running on Broadway can try again, and again, and again, and again, and again. Because that is the thing that is consistent about a lot of white failures, is that they're given multiple opportunities to try again. And so, and nobody really questions, like, how one defines its success. It's just that, like, and so that's what I'm sort of curious to know, is like, will I be given another opportunity? And if not, how do I feel about that? And what then is my metric of success? My metric of success is always going to be artistic, because the marketplace is going to be the marketplace is going to be the marketplace. And so it might mean that if I'm somebody who prioritizes the art over everything else, I then have to find a financial model that sustains that. And that financial model that sustains that may very well not be Broadway. And I would be happy with that, because as I reminded you, my highest aspiration at the time was an off-Broadway run of my show, which I got, which we sold out and extended like 3 times. And it was financially successful, but just on a different scale. And it was exactly what I needed, and it was the thing that led to me winning the Pulitzer and all of that and everything else. So I think that we just have to be a little bit more nuanced in thinking about what success is and what closures mean and what long runs mean and all of that, because it's a lot of different pieces that go into what those things mean.
Thank you.
And I'm so sorry we're running short. I think we just have time for one last question, so please, yes.
Hi, my name is Ida Mai. I work here in Detroit at Culture Source. I'm an arts administrator. I have a quick little two-parter. First is, I know you were saying you worked on Strange Loop for a very long time. Was that hard for you when you hit the point where you're like, oh, I'm finished and I'm gonna release this to the world? Was there any sort of emptiness with that? And how did you work with that? Second part is, do you like Gossip Girl? Because your next musical with the scheming reminded me of that. Yeah.
So the first question is, I never really thought, I don't feel that I'm finished. I mean, I put pencils are down, but like, A Strange Loop is so connected to me that I always say that when it changes, I change, and when I change, it changes. And so even today, like, you know, when we got to our last performance, I watched it again after having not seen it for a while, and I saw certain things with a new eye, where I was like, oh, if I had like one more, you know, chance to hit this, I would change this, and that. Not like the story overall, but like little things that add up to the overall meaning of it. And so I sort of take that position with everything that I write, that it's always a work in progress. And with regard to Gossip Girl, the funny thing is that I was asked to be on Gossip Girl. Like, they had this cameo where it was the craziest thing. They wanted me to play an usher at a Broadway show as like a little nod to whatever. And I said, nah, I'm not doing that. So, but yeah, look, I'm not a Gossip Girl person. I watched the first iteration of it back in the like 2007s or whenever it was on. Yeah, I mean, but it certainly connects with White Girl in Danger, but also not really.
Awesome. Well, I would like to ask Michael if he might be willing to transition to the piano. And as he does, I just want to remind everyone that you can learn everything about Michael on his website at thelivingmichaeljackson.com. And obviously look for tickets for the previews and the world premiere of White Girl in Danger coming up in March. And Michael, obviously, you know, one of the most powerful songs, as you mentioned, in A Strange Loop is Memory Song. And just wondering if you could share just a little about the context of Memory Song.
Yeah, so Memory Song came about in part because of the story I told earlier of a teacher saying if you're a lyricist who'd never written music. But there was a piece that came before that a couple of months earlier where there was an assignment we had in class where I think it was called Writing from Yourself. And one of my classmates had performed, he wrote the lyric, he was a composer lyricist, but for this assignment he was paired with a composer and he wrote the lyrics and the other composer wrote the music. And he had written this song about this young black gay man who had sort of woken up from like a drug-induced sort of hookup or something like along that, and he was sort of singing about the shame that he felt about this hookup, and then he sang the song in class, and we were all just listening to it. And as I listened to it, he sort of reminded me or the character in the song, who was sort of loosely based on him, sort of reminded me of a lot of black gay boys that I had known in high school, and I was just very taken by it. And so I reached into my notebook, because at the time I was just keeping little ideas for lyrics, and the thing that came up for me was this phrase, all those black gay boys I knew who chose to go on back to the Lord. And it was just that in my notebook for months, until that assignment came about lyricists writing music or composers writing lyrics. And so I was flipping through my notebook looking for something to set to music, and I fell upon that phrase, and that I said it. And it just sort of took on a life of its own after that. And then there's a whole other part of the story about how the song wound up in the show, but that was how it began.
Everyone, Michael R. Jackson performing Memory Song.
"5'4", high school gym, sneaking a cupcake. These are my memories, these are my memories. Shooting hoops off the rim, slow on the uptake. These are my memories, these are my memories. After gym, the locker room, my eyes photographic. Naked me measures in and 4.5 inches. These are my memories, these are my memories of one lone black gay boy I knew who chose to turn his back on the Lord. One lone black gay boy I knew who chose to turn his back on the Lord. Guilt and shame, Jesus' name, church every Sunday. These are my memories, these are my memories. Eat his body, drink his blood, communion buffet. These are my memories, these are my memories. After church, we're driving home to Radio Crackle. Jazz music or Motown blues, and skin is a shackle. For one lone black gay boy I knew who chose to turn his back on the Lord. One lone black gay boy I knew who chose to turn his back on the Lord. These are my memories, sweet sour memories. This is my history, this is my mystery. Napping on the couch and Dad cuts the grass while I watch TV all day long, young and the restless, like one lone black gay boy I knew who chose to turn his back on the Lord. One lone black gay boy I knew who chose to turn his back on the Lord. Dad is drunk and on the couch while Mom eats a pork chop. Daily bread mill, daily treadmill, won't ever stop. One lone black gay boy I knew who chose to turn his back on the Lord. One lone black gay boy I knew who chose to turn his back on the Lord. I am lying on the couch, I dream that I'm flying, flapping both my wings so hard to keep me from dying, with the crown of God-forsaken thorns on my head. Like all those black gay boys I knew who chose to go on back to the Lord. All those black gay boys I knew who chose to go on back to the Lord. All those black gay boys I knew who chose to go on back to the Lord. And one lone black gay boy I knew who chose to turn his back on the Lord.
Thank you all for joining us for SphinxConnect, and see you at the finals concert. Thank you.